So next up, we need to talk about nesting loops. So having one for loop, in this case for loops, inside of another for loop. We can nest all sorts of loops. Once we get to while loops, I could nest one inside of another, or I could nest a while loop inside of a for loop, or vice versa. But right now, we're talking about nesting for loops. So the idea here is literally putting a for loop inside the body of another for loop. But in practice, what this means is that for every single iteration of the outer loop, let's say it runs 5 times, the inner loop is going to have its own full cycle. 5 separate times it gets a full cycle. So let me try and illustrate that in a better way. Let's make a simple for loop. For let I equals 0. Let's go from 0 to maybe 10. So I less than 10, or maybe we'll do 1 to 10. Okay, so less than or equal to 10, and then I plus plus. And we'll print out console.log I. Let's use a string template literal. I is, and then let's print out I. Okay, so let's just make sure that works. I didn't screw it up. Cool. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 10. Now, I'm going to nest a loop afterwards. And this time, I'm not going to use I, I'm going to use J, which is pretty common to use. Just other single letters. Usually it's I and then J. And if we had a third level of nesting, we could use K. That's the alphabet, right? H-I-J-K-L. Yes. You don't have to do any of that. You could name this first I and second I, or sometimes people use inner and outer just to make it easier. Because honestly, I is easy enough to keep track of when it's one loop, but when you have I and J and maybe K, it's a big headache to wrap your head around. But we'll just do I and J because that's really common. And I'm going to start with J. I'll do this. Should I do the same thing? Maybe we'll just do from 1 to 3. So 1, I less than or equal to 3, or we'll do less than 4 maybe. I plus plus. See, I already screwed it up. See how I did I here? I'm supposed to be working with J. I think I'm going to leave this in the video just to illustrate the perils of working with nested loops. One of the issues here, at least for me, is it's so easy to mix that up. Trust me, I edit a lot of stuff out. It's very easy for me to do that, but I think I'll keep it in here because that's very real, at least to my experience writing nested loops. Okay, so in here I'm just going to console.log J is, let's do a string template literal. Just like this. So J is, and then we'll put J there. And I'm just going to add a bunch of space in here so that we can see it visually printing out differently. So I'll fix that string template literal, and let's take a look. Okay, so that's why I indented it so we can see that the J inner loop a little bit clearer. So let's walk through what happens. Our outer loop runs 10 times. So I is going to be 1, and then it will be 2, and then 3, and so on. But while I is 1, we have this entire nested loop, which runs for J, starting at 1, up to, but not including 4, so 1 to 3. So we end up with 1 iteration for J, 2, 3 for J, all while we're on the first iteration for I. And then we get to the end of this line, or the end of this loop, and then we move on, and I goes up, and I is now 2, and the whole process repeats. So we end up with 1, 2, 3 for J, and this happens 10 times total because this outer loop runs 10 times. So you can see what we end up with. I is 1, and then here's our 3 loops, 3 iterations on the inner loop. I is 2, 3 iterations on the inside. So whenever you have nested loops, you end up with a lot of iterations. It's very, very different from just 2 side-by-side loops. This runs 10 times roughly. This runs 3 times. 13 total console.logs, right? If I just ran that right now, I'm not going to count. Let's just say roughly 13. I might have messed up the inclusiveness or exclusiveness. Now, when I put this inside, now we end up with 10 iterations, and on each iteration, we're doing 3 things. So roughly to calculate the number of iterations, we would multiply 10 times 3 here. So you get 30, although that's really the amount of inner iterations here, or the console.logs. We have 30 of these, and then we've got 10 of these. So it's more like 40 total. The specifics don't matter. I just want you to understand that it's a lot more. One common area where nested loops come up is when we need to traverse or iterate across nested arrays. So I've got an example here. I'm calling it seating chart, this variable. It's an array full of 3 subarrays. And it's supposed to represent If you're, I don't know, a middle school teacher or something, you have to make a seating chart of the different chairs and desks and all of that, and figure out who sits where based upon a whole bunch of criteria. Who works well together, who are the mortal enemies and the best friends who are going to chat too much. And I don't know. I've never taught middle school, but I remember there being a seating chart. So each one of these subarrays could represent a row, right? So we've got our first row, second row, and third row. And let's say that I want to print them all out. Just something simple. Just print out every student's name like I'm doing roll call or something. Okay? So to do that, one loop is not enough. I could do for let I equals 0, I is less than seating chart dot length I plus plus, and then if I console.log seating chart of I, what will I see? What will be printed out here? Well, I'm printing out the entire array. So if I wanted to instead print out each individual name, what I need to do is now loop over seating chart of I. Seating chart of I is just this. The first time through, I is 0, so seating chart of 0. Then next time through, seating chart of I is 1. So it's this subarray. And then I is 2, and it's this, and then I is 3, and we're done. There is no index 3 in this array. So then I need to iterate over seating chart of I. And what I like to do at least is save that to a variable. Seating chart of I, that represents a row. So let's just make a variable called row, right? This is our first row. It's smaller, only 3 students, 3 desks, and then our second row and third row. So now we need to iterate over row. So for, most commonly you'll see j, let j equal 0. J is less than, and this is where you have to be careful. We're not working with seating chart anymore. We're working with row because I made that variable. So j is less than row dot length, j plus plus, and then let's console.log row of j. And up here, let's do, well, we can just start with that and make sure it works. There we go. We're getting every student from Kristen down to Erica. And I could do a console.log row. Why don't I do like row 1, row 2, row 3? So I could actually print the row number. So I'll do row, and then I can add I in here, but there's a problem, a small problem, which is that my numbering starts at 0 because I needs to begin at 0. So why don't I make it row 1, 2, and 3 by just adding 1 to what we print out right there. So row I plus 1, and maybe I'll put a number sign, a little hash symbol right there. There we go. Row number 1, Kristen, Eric, Namata. Row number 2, Jeffrey, Juanita, Antonio, Kevin. Row number 3, Yuma, Sakura, Jack, Erica. Cool. So if you're at all lost on this bit, nested arrays, first of all, know that you are not in the minority there. When I teach this in person, nested arrays is, in particular, looping and iterating over nested arrays is always a little bit tricky. So take some time to go over it and break it down. I mean, you can literally write out what I and J are at each step. I do this often on a whiteboard with students. We'll make like a table like this. What's I? What's J? What is row? What is seating chart of I? All of that stuff, write it down and iterate mentally through this process, and it generally will become clearer. If not, practice and time will help that as well. So don't panic if you're feeling it all stuck here. It's a really normal place to hit a little bit of a speed bump. Roadblock, speed bump, whatever. Okay, bye.